My husband's son showed up at my door 14 days after the funeral with a man I had never seen before. The man was carrying a briefcase. He stood one step behind Thomas on my front porch, which is the porch of the house I shared with Walter for 18 years, and he introduced himself as an attorney. He said his name and the name of his firm, and the words came out in the specific tone of a professional who has delivered difficult information before and has learned to deliver it without inflection, as though the absence of emotion makes the content more reasonable. Thomas said, "Ruth, we need to talk about the house." I said, "Come in, then. I want to tell you right now that I almost did not say that. I almost stood there in my doorway and told Thomas and his attorney that they could schedule an appointment through my own attorney if they had something to say about legal matters. I had that instinct. I have always had good instincts. But I let them in. I made coffee. I sat across from them at the kitchen table and I listened. And what they said to me that morning was one of the most calculated things I have ever heard, delivered in the most pleasant possible voice. My name is Ruth Coleman. I am 61 years old. I was born in Columbia, South Carolina, and I have lived in Charleston for most of my adult life. I spent 26 years as a paralegal at a firm that specialized in estate and trust law, which means that when Thomas's attorney sat down at my kitchen table with his briefcase and his pleasant voice and started talking about contested wills and disputed intentions and the legal rights of biological children in blended family estates, I understood every word of what he was actually saying. He was saying that Thomas intended to take my house. I sat across from them and I drank my coffee and I let him finish. And when he was done, I said, "I appreciate you coming. I'll have my attorney contact you." Thomas looked at me for a moment. He was 44 years old and he had his father's eyes, which made looking at him on that particular day an experience I would not describe as comfortable. He said, "Ruth, we don't want this to be adversarial." I said, "Of course not." I showed them to the door. Then I called my attorney. So, the beginning. Walter James Coleman was 63 years old when he died. He had been my husband for 18 years, which means he was 45 when we married and I was 43. We were both, by that point, people who had been adults long enough to know what we actually wanted in a partner, which is a clarity that younger people sometimes lack and that I find, in retrospect, to be one of the genuine advantages of marrying later in life. I want to tell you about Walter, because he is the center of this story and he deserves to be more than context for what happened after he was gone. He was an architect. Not the residential kind. He had no interest in designing houses for individual clients, in the particular negotiation of personal taste and lifestyle that residential architecture requires. He designed public buildings, civic spaces, libraries and courthouses, and the kind of mid-sized municipal building that anchors a neighborhood without calling attention to itself. He had a theory about this, which he had explained to me on our third date in the specific way he explained things he cared about, carefully, not because he thought I could not understand it quickly but because he wanted to get it right. He said, "The buildings people notice are not always the ones that do the most work. The building that changes how a neighborhood feels is usually the one that people walk past every day without consciously looking at it. It sits at the right angle to the street. It puts windows where light is useful. It makes a courtyard that people stop in without knowing why. That is the work I am interested in." I said, "You make buildings people don't notice." He said, "I make buildings people live with comfortably without having to think about it. Which is harder than making buildings people look at." That quality, the preference for function over appearance, the interest in what actually works over what is impressive, ran through everything Walter did. He was not a man who performed. He did not need you to know that he was the smartest person in the room, which made him the kind of person you could actually think alongside. He listened. He changed his mind when the evidence warranted it. He was patient with process in a way that I, who had spent 26 years watching impatient people make costly mistakes in legal matters, deeply respected. He had been married before. His first wife was named Catherine. They had divorced when Thomas was 12 years old, after 8 years of marriage. Walter was careful about how he described that period of his life, not evasive, but thoughtful in a way that I came to understand was both his native temperament and a deliberate choice about what it meant to be honest without being destructive. He did not speak badly about Catherine. What I understood from the spaces in what he said was that they had been wrong for each other in ways that became clearer over time, and that by the time they acknowledged it, the acknowledgement was more sad than hostile. He had been a present father in the ways that divorced fathers can be present, financially, logistically, consistently available in the specific windows that the arrangement allowed. He had driven to Atlanta for Thomas's school events. He had taken Thomas on trips. He had maintained the particular kind of relationship that requires effort to sustain across distance and which slowly builds into something the child does not always recognize as love until they are old enough to understand what it cost. Thomas had grown up primarily with Catherine. He had had a relationship with Walter, visits, holidays, the careful architecture of a divorced family's calendar, but it was not the relationship of a child in the same house. By the time Walter and I married, Thomas was in his mid-20s and had already built the habits and perspectives of a man who had grown up in a particular household that did not include his father as a daily presence. He came to the wedding. He was cordial. He called Walter regularly. He visited Charleston 2 or 3 times a year. He brought his children when they came, and Walter was the kind of grandfather who remembered what each grandchild was interested in and asked about it specifically, the kind who carved out time at visits to be with the children without the mediation of the adults. Thomas called me Ruth. Not anything warmer. I did not expect anything warmer and did not want it. I was not his mother and I had no interest in pretending I was or creating the pressure of a relationship neither of us had chosen. We were civil and pleasant for 18 years in a room that contained someone we both loved, and I had thought that was enough, and I had thought I understood what we were to each other. 14 days after the funeral, I understood that I had been wrong about that. I met Walter at a professional association event in the spring of 2006. I had attended because a colleague had insisted and I had agreed out of social obligation rather than genuine interest. Walter was speaking, briefly, on a panel about public architecture and civic responsibility, and I noticed him because of the quality of his attention. He was not performing for the audience. He was thinking out loud in front of them, which is a different thing and much rarer. We were introduced afterward by the colleague who had insisted I attend, who had known Walter professionally for years and who I later suspected of engineering the introduction deliberately. He asked questions about my work. He listened to the answers. He asked a follow-up question that demonstrated he had actually heard the first answer, which I found, in the specific way of a person who has spent years in rooms where people mostly wait for their turn to speak, unexpectedly charming. He called me the following week. We had dinner. We talked for 4 hours and I drove home noticing that I had not checked my phone once. We dated for 2 years before we discussed marriage. Not because either of us was uncertain but because we were both, by our 40s, people who understood that rushing was not always the same as enthusiasm and that the steady building of something was often more reliable than the rapid construction of it. We married in 2008. We have lived in this house since 2009, when we found it together, walking through it on a Saturday morning with a realtor who had shown us 4 other properties we had politely declined, and Walter had stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the light coming through the back window and said, "This is it." I said, "You can tell from the light?" He said, "I can always tell from the light." We bought it. He died in November, 18 years later, in the bedroom at the end of the hall, in the light he had always known was right. Walter died in November. He was 63 years old and his kidneys had been failing for 2 years. It was not sudden. We had known for some time that the trajectory was not good, and we had spent those 2 years doing what people do when they know what is coming, saying the things that needed to be said, making the decisions that needed to be made, building the specific closeness that I believe is only possible when you are both fully aware of what you are losing and have decided to be present for it rather than avoid it. He was specific and deliberate about his affairs. I need to tell you that about him, because it matters to everything that follows. Walter was the kind of man who drew up plans before he built things and who thought carefully about how those plans would work in practice before he committed to them. He revised them when revision was warranted. He did not proceed on the assumption that things would work out, he made the things work out, or he changed the plan. He had updated his will 2 years before he died, with full awareness of his diagnosis and its implications. He had sat with his attorney, a woman named Margaret Webb, who had handled our family's legal matters for a decade, and he had been specific about his intentions and why he had arrived at them. He left me the house. Not just the house and the investment accounts and the insurance policies and the contents of the savings account we had built together over 18 years. He left Thomas a substantial monetary bequest, more than $80,000, which was Walter's acknowledgement of his son and his genuine care for him. But the house we had shared for 18 years and that I had loved and tended and filled with the specific life we had built together, Walter left to me. He told me this himself, in the last months of his life, not as a disclosure but as a conversation. He said, "I want you to understand why I made the choices I made, not just what they are." He said, "Thomas is 44 years old and he has built his own life and he has resources of his own. You are my wife and this is your home and I am not going to leave you vulnerable to anyone." He said, "Margaret has made it as clear as it can be made." I thanked him. I told him I understood. I told him I hoped we would not need to have this conversation referenced for a very long time. He died 7 months later. I want to tell you something about the 18 years between our wedding and his death, because they are the foundation of everything and they are worth saying. We were not a dramatic couple. I mean that in the best possible way. We did not have the particular kind of relationship that produces stories of passionate conflict and dramatic reconciliation. We were too old for that by the time we found each other, too clear about what we wanted and too direct about saying it. What we had instead was the kind of marriage that does not make for good television but makes for a very good life. We worked alongside each other. We built things together, not literally, not in the way Walter built buildings, but in the accumulated sense of a shared life. We had dinner together most evenings. We talked about our work, our concerns, the things we were reading and thinking about. We traveled twice a year, to places one of us had a specific reason to want to see. We had friends in common and friends separately and we did not feel that the separateness was a threat to anything. We disagreed sometimes. Walter was, in most things, measured and patient, but he had opinions and he held them, and there were subjects on which we did not see things the same way. We had learned to argue well, not to avoid conflict but to conduct it in the specific way that takes the other person seriously and is interested in being right rather than in winning. That is a skill, and it is one that I believe gets easier with time and honesty. He had qualities that I loved and qualities that drove me to distraction in the mild way that long familiarity makes familiar. He was constitutionally incapable of being in a hurry. He did not understand the concept of good enough. There was always a refinement, always one more consideration, always one more thing to look at before the decision was final. He would stop in the middle of a walk to look at a building we had passed 100 times, as though it had just revealed something new to him. I loved all of it. Even the parts that drove me to distraction. Especially those parts, in retrospect. What I want you to understand about those 18 years is that they were a life. A full, complete, specific life that belonged to both of us and that we built together with the same care and attention that Walter brought to his buildings. And when Thomas arrived on my porch with his briefcase, what he was attempting to take was not just a property or an asset, it was the physical embodiment of that life. The place where it had happened. The space that held it. Walter understood that. That is why he protected it the way he did. Thomas came to the funeral with his wife Sandra and his 2 children. He was composed in the way that people are composed when they have been preparing for something for a long time and have used up most of their acute grief before the event arrives. His children, Walter's grandchildren, 8 and 11 years old, who had come to Charleston several times over the years and who Walter had loved with the specific joy that grandparents are allowed to have without the daily responsibilities of parents, they were not composed. They cried in the pews and I held the 11-year-old's hand, which was something I had not expected to be doing but which felt like the right thing to do. The service was at the church where Walter and I had been married, which he had chosen for its proportions and its light. Characteristically, he had attended a church based in part on the quality of its architecture, which was something I had teased him about for years. The minister had known him. His colleagues came from 3 cities. His former partners at the firm. The city planning officers he had worked with on the library project. Neighbors. Friends from the neighborhood association where he had been quietly useful for a decade without ever wanting to be in charge of anything. Walter had been, in the way of genuinely good people, more widely appreciated than he knew. The number of people in those pews was more than either of us had anticipated, and I found myself, in between the grief and the ceremony, feeling a kind of gratitude, for the life he had built, for the people he had made a difference to, for the specific quality of his presence in the world that had been apparent to others as well as to me. After the service there was a reception at the house. People came and went for 3 hours. I accepted condolences and told stories and accepted food that neighbors had brought and tried to be present in the way that bereaved people are expected to be present at the social machinery of grief. It is not my natural mode. I am, by temperament, more comfortable with the private version of things, but I understood the function of it and I did what was required. After the last guests left, Thomas stayed. He helped me clear up. Not in a performative way, he simply rolled up his sleeves and started washing dishes, which was not something I had seen him do before and which reminded me, unexpectedly, of a quality in Walter that I had always valued. The willingness to do the practical thing without being asked or appreciated for it. We sat in the kitchen afterward. Sandra had taken the children to the hotel. It was just the 2 of us and the specific quality of the silence that remains when a house full of people empties and the person you expected to be there is not. We talked about Walter for 2 hours. Thomas told me stories I had not heard, the specific stories that exist only between a father and a son, the ones that had never come up in the 18 years of holiday tables and polite conversation that had constituted our relationship. Walter teaching Thomas to drive in an empty parking lot in Atlanta on a Sunday morning. Walter showing up unannounced at Thomas's college graduation because he had learned about it secondhand and driven 8 hours without telling anyone. Walter sending Thomas a hand-drawn diagram of a structural problem Thomas had encountered in his own work. Thomas was a civil engineer, with notes in the architectural print that I recognized, the careful letters that meant something he wanted to get right. I told Thomas stories too. The library and the light. The way Walter would stop in front of buildings he had not designed and stand there considering them, as though even other people's buildings were problems worth thinking about. The roses he had planted because I had mentioned, once, that I had never had a yard. Thomas said, "He talked about you. Not the way, he did not report on your marriage or discuss your private life. But when I asked how he was, he would mention you. Something you had said. Something you were doing. It was the way people mention someone when the person is part of how they are." I said, "I know. He was that way about you too." We sat for a while with that. And then Thomas said, "I should let you get some rest." And he hugged me, which was not something we had done habitually, and it was not uncomfortable. And I thought, going upstairs that night, that perhaps the loss had created something between us. That perhaps we would be closer on the other side of it. 14 days later, he arrived on my porch with a briefcase. "I want to tell you something I have thought about many times since that evening in the kitchen. I wonder if Thomas knew, sitting at that kitchen table telling me those stories, what he was planning to do 14 days later. Whether the warmth of that evening was sincere, or whether it was the warmth of a man who was already calculating and was being kind because the kindness was easier than the alternative. I do not know the answer. I have decided I do not need to. What I know is what happened. And what I know is that Walter had seen it coming. I called Margaret Webb the morning they left. Margaret had been handling the Coleman family's legal matters for a decade. She was 67 years old and had been drawing up and protecting estates for 32 years. She had a quality I had always valued in the attorneys I worked with, the quality of not performing concern when plain information was more useful. She told you what was, not what you might prefer to hear, and she told it without softening that reduced the clarity. She had been expecting my call. Not because she had known Thomas would do this, though Walter had discussed the possibility with her, but because she had known that some version of difficulty was a reasonable possibility and she had prepared for it. When I described what Thomas's attorney had said, she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right. Let me tell you what this is and what we have." She explained the undue influence claim, the legal argument that the person making the will had been improperly influenced by someone close to them and that the document therefore did not reflect their genuine intentions. She explained why it was a standard challenge in contested estate cases involving surviving spouses and adult children from previous marriages. She explained, specifically, why it was going to be very difficult to sustain in this particular case. She said, "The first thing that matters is timing. Walter revised this will 2 years ago. 2 years ago, his kidney disease was serious but not debilitating. He was working. He was thinking clearly. He was engaged in his professional life. If Thomas's claim is that Walter was in a diminished state when he made his decisions, we are going to ask him to explain why he waited 18 months after that revision to raise the concern, and we are going to provide medical documentation of Walter's cognitive status at the time that will make the claim very difficult to sustain." I said, "What's the second thing?" She said, "My notes. I have detailed notes from every meeting I had with Walter about this estate. Notes about what he said, what he asked, what he changed, why he changed it. A man who is being unduly influenced does not ask the kinds of questions Walter asked. He does not push back on suggestions the way Walter did. He does not request specific revisions based on his own reasoning. I have all of that documented." She paused. Then she said, "And there is the letter." She told me about the letter the way you tell someone something that is going to matter to them, carefully, completely, without rushing past the parts that needed to be felt as well as heard. She told me Walter had given it to her 6 months before he died. That he had said he hoped it would never be needed but that if it was, he wanted her to have it. That he had asked her to tell me about it if Thomas ever made a challenge but not before, because he did not want to spend whatever time he had left preparing me for something that might not happen. He had written in the letter. She told me what was in it before I read it, so that I would not be alone with the information when I first encountered it. She said, "He wanted you to know that he had thought this through completely. That the decisions were his, made in full awareness of his situation and the people in his life. And that he had done what he could to make sure you were protected." I said, "When can I come in?" She said, "Tomorrow morning. I will have coffee ready." I drove to her office the next morning. The letter was in a sealed envelope. Walter's handwriting on the front. I opened it at Margaret's desk and she stepped out and gave me the room. The letter took me 20 minutes to read. Not because it was long, it was 4 pages, not long for Walter, but because I read each page slowly and then sat with it before moving to the next. There are things you want to hold correctly, and reading them too fast is a way of letting them go before you have had the chance to keep them. I will tell you what the letter contained in substance. The personal parts are mine. But the substance matters for the story, and Walter was not a private man in the sense of hiding what he thought. He was careful about what he said, not about what he meant. He wrote about Thomas. He wrote with love, I want to be clear about that. He wrote as a father who understood his son's limitations without dismissing his son's value. He wrote about his awareness that the estate decisions might cause Thomas pain and his wish that they would not. He wrote about why he had made them the way he had, his belief that Thomas was financially stable and professionally established, his belief that the substantial monetary bequest was meaningful and appropriate, his belief that the house and the rest of the estate were mine in a way that extended beyond legal right into the territory of the life we had built. He wrote about the conversation he had had with Thomas. The date. What he had said. What Thomas had said. His hope that the conversation had resolved the matter and his awareness that it might not have. His decision to prepare for both possibilities. And he wrote to me directly. He said, "Ruth, you know what this house is. You know what these years have been. I need you to know that everything in this estate is yours because I want it to be yours, because it is right that it be yours, and because I have done everything I could think of to make sure that no one can successfully argue otherwise. I have been methodical about this the way I am methodical about everything I build." He said, "The person who loves you carefully enough is thinking about what you will need after they are gone. I hope I have thought carefully enough. I sat with that for a long time in Margaret's office. Then I went back into the room where she was waiting and I said, "We file." The challenge Thomas's attorney had filed was a claim of undue influence, as Margaret had predicted. It alleged that Walter had been in a compromised cognitive state during the period of the will's revision and that the provisions reflected my preferences rather than Walter's intentions. Margaret's response was methodical and complete. She produced the physician's documentation of Walter's cognitive status at the time of every significant legal decision, clear and competent on each date, the records unambiguous. She produced her own notes from every meeting with Walter, which showed his active and specific engagement with every clause, his questions, his revisions, his reasoning as he had expressed it to her in real time. She produced the letter. She produced Walter's own email correspondence from the period in question, which showed the same active, specific, forward-looking mind that had always characterized him. And she produced the record of the conversation Walter had referenced in the letter, not a formal document, but something more useful. Walter had told his physician about the conversation with Thomas. It was in the clinical notes, recorded the following week, in the context of a discussion about stress and its effect on his condition. Walter had mentioned, in passing, that he had spoken to Thomas about his estate intentions and that the conversation had been difficult. The physician had noted this. The note was dated, specific, and consistent with the letter. Thomas's attorney filed a motion for an expedited hearing. Margaret filed her response. I sat in her office on the day the response was submitted and I read through every page, and I thought about Walter at his desk drawing the letter by hand, the careful architectural print, the specific intentions made clear, the foresight of a man who had spent his professional life thinking about what things would look like in 100 years. He had built for the long term. Even in this. If you have ever had to protect what the person you loved left you, type "I protected it" in the comments. I read every word. The hearing was scheduled for 3 months after Thomas filed his challenge. In the meantime, Margaret had filed for a temporary injunction preventing any action on the disputed assets pending resolution of the challenge. The injunction was granted. I was not going to be displaced from my home while the legal process moved. I want to tell you about those 3 months, because they were not easy and because the difficulty of them is part of the story. Thomas and I did not speak directly during that period. His attorney communicated with Margaret. That was the arrangement both sides had agreed to. I understood the arrangement and I respected it. But the absence of direct communication meant that the cordial relationship we had maintained for 18 years existed now in a kind of suspension, neither of us sure what it would look like on the other side of this, or if there would be an other side. I continued my life. I went to work. I had reduced my hours since Walter's diagnosis, but I had not stopped working, and the work was useful to me in the way that purposeful occupation is useful during difficult periods. I tended the house. I walked the neighborhood in the mornings, the same route Walter and I had walked together in the years before he became too ill to walk far, the route that passes the library he had helped design in 2012 and that he had always slowed down in front of without making a point of it. I thought about him differently during those 3 months than I had thought about him in the years before he was sick and in the years of watching him become sicker. Those years had produced a particular kind of grief, the grief of anticipation, which is real grief but also incomplete grief, suspended in the specific tension of a loss that has not yet fully arrived. The grief of the 3 months after Thomas filed was different. It was grief with a task attached to it, which in some ways is easier and in some ways is harder. Easier because the task gives you something to do with your attention. Harder because the task requires you to think about the person you have lost in terms of their vulnerability, their final decisions, the specific way they were taken advantage of after they were no longer present to defend themselves. I thought about Walter writing that letter. The careful architectural print. The specific, deliberate effort to make his intentions clear in a form that would survive him. He had known, in writing it, that he might be gone when it was read. He had written knowing that. He had been precise and specific and affectionate all at once, in the way he had been precise and specific and affectionate his entire life, and I had read it at Margaret's desk and had understood in a new way why I had loved him. He had been protecting me before he was gone. He had been thinking about what I would face when he was no longer here to be present with me, and he had done what he could from the distance of the future. I thought also, during those 3 months, about Thomas. Not with anger. Anger was not what I felt, though I understand why it might have been. What I felt was something more like the specific sadness of watching a person you have been cordial with for 18 years reveal themselves to be smaller than the space you had imagined them in. Not a bad person, not evil, I do not believe Thomas is either of those things. But a person who, faced with loss and money and the specific alchemy of the two, had made a choice that I would not have made and that Walter would not have wanted him to make. I thought about the conversation Walter had described in the letter. The 18-month-old conversation in which Walter had explained directly what his intentions were and Thomas had said he understood. I turned that conversation over in my mind many times during those 3 months. I tried to imagine what Thomas had been thinking when he said it. Whether he had meant it at the time and changed his mind later, or whether he had said it knowing he did not mean it. I do not know the answer to that. I have made my peace with not knowing. The hearing was scheduled for 3 months after Thomas filed his challenge. In the meantime, Margaret had filed for a temporary injunction preventing any action on the disputed assets pending resolution. The injunction was granted. I was not going to be displaced from my home while the process moved. The hearing lasted 1 day. I was there. Margaret had told me, as she had told me before the hearing, that I did not need to be. I told her the same thing I had told her before, I was going to be there. She accepted that without argument. We arrived at the courthouse early. Thomas was already in the building when we arrived. He was in the corridor with his attorney, and we passed within 20 feet of each other. He looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us spoke. His face had the expression of someone who has committed to something they are not entirely certain about and who has not yet decided what to feel about it. I thought about the kitchen. The stories about Walter. The hug at the door. Then the hearing began. Margaret presented the case with the thoroughness of someone who had prepared it in full awareness that it needed to be unassailable. The physician testified about Walter's cognitive status at the time of the will revisions, specific, documented, unambiguous. Margaret testified about her own process and her notes, the active engagement Walter had brought to every clause, his questions, his revisions, his reasoning. The letter was entered as an exhibit. Walter's email correspondence from the period in question was entered. And then the clinical note. 3 sentences in the physician's handwriting, dated 18 months before Walter's death, recorded in real time in a clinical record with no stake in any legal outcome. Walter had mentioned, in a discussion about stress and cardiac health, that he had had a difficult conversation with his son about the estate. That the conversation had not gone entirely as he had hoped. That he believed the matter was resolved. Thomas's attorney had not subpoenaed the clinical records. Margaret had. Thomas testified. He described his father as having seemed confused during the period of the will revisions. He described specific conversations he said had concerned him. He described feeling that Walter was not the same person he had known. Margaret cross-examined him. She produced dated correspondence showing Walter's characteristic intellectual precision during those same periods. She produced the email chain. She asked about the conversation. She said, "Did you have a conversation with your father approximately 18 months before his death in which he discussed his estate intentions with you?" Thomas said, "Yes." She said, "At that time, did your father appear confused or unduly influenced to you?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. Long enough that the quality of the silence was itself a kind of testimony. He said, "No." She said, "Did you express concern to your father at that time about his cognitive state?" He said, "No." She said, "Did your father explain his reasons for the estate decisions he had made?" He said, "He did." She said, "Did you indicate to your father that you understood his reasons?" Another pause. He said, "I did." Margaret said, "Thank you." No further questions. The judge's decision came 12 days later. I read it at Margaret's office, at the same desk where I had read Walter's letter 4 months earlier. The challenge was dismissed. The will was upheld in full. The estate passed as Walter had directed, the monetary bequest to Thomas, the house and remaining assets to me. I sat with that document for a moment. Then I said to Margaret, "What do I owe you?" She gave me the number. I wrote the check. She said, "Walter would be pleased." I said, "I know." I drove home. I stood in the garden in the November light. The roses were in their resting period, past the summer bloom, pulling back toward dormancy, doing the underground work that would make the following summer's bloom possible. Walter had always said the resting period was when the important work happened. Invisible and necessary. I stood there until the cold made me go inside. Thomas's attorney contacted Margaret the following week with a request. Thomas wanted to know if there was a possibility of communication between us. Margaret passed this to me and left the decision entirely in my hands. I sat with it for 2 weeks. I did not feel warmly toward Thomas. I am not someone who performs feelings I do not have. The combination of what he had done, the timing of it, the 14 days, the briefcase, the specific calculation of arriving on my porch before the grief had even found its shape, and the knowledge that Walter had told him directly and he had proceeded anyway, that combination had changed something between us that I did not expect to change back. But I also thought about the children. The 8 and 11-year-olds who had cried in the pews. Walter's grandchildren. Part of whatever I was going to do with the remaining years of my life in this city. I decided that I would respond. Not with warmth I did not feel, but with the openness of someone who understands that grief and money together produce behavior that people would not choose under other circumstances, and that the accounting for that behavior belongs to the person who chose it, and that my own peace was worth more than the sustained performance of grievance. I wrote Thomas a letter. By hand, in my own words, not through Margaret. I told him the legal matter was concluded and that I had no interest in revisiting it. I told him his father had loved him and that I had watched that love for 18 years. I told him his children were welcome in this house and that I would make them dinners and that that was what I was prepared to offer. I told him I hoped he would find his peace with what his father had chosen. I did not ask him to find peace with what he had done to me. That was his work, not mine. He wrote back. Brief and not comfortable, the letter of a man who is sorry for something and does not quite know how to say it. I read it once. I put it in the drawer where I keep things that matter but that I do not need to return to. If you found this channel today, subscribe. Every week there is a new story. You are going to want to be here. I live in this house. I want to say that clearly, and I want to say it more than once, because it is the most important fact of this story and it deserves the weight of repetition. I live in this house. The kitchen where they sat with their briefcase is my kitchen. The garden with Walter's roses is my garden. The bedroom where he died in the light he had always known was right is the bedroom where I sleep. I want to tell you about the roses. Walter planted them the second summer we lived here. I had mentioned once, in passing, in the context of talking about something else entirely, I do not even remember what, that I had always wanted roses but had never had a yard of my own until now. I said it once. I did not think he had registered it particularly. The following spring, he came home from the nursery with 3 rose plants and a bag of amendments and a paperback guide to rose cultivation that he had apparently ordered online and read. He spent a Saturday in the garden. He did not ask me to help. He did not make a presentation of it. He simply did it, and when I came outside in the afternoon he was standing back from the newly planted beds with the evaluative expression he used for his own work, and he said, "I got a climbing variety for the fence and 2 bush varieties for the beds." I asked which varieties were best suited for this climate and these soil conditions. I said, "I mentioned that once." He said, "I know. But you haven't had a yard before. You should have roses if you want them." I want to tell you about the last 2 years of his life, because they are not separate from this story, they are the foundation of it. When Walter's doctors made clear that his kidney disease was not going to resolve, that the trajectory was downward and that the question was of pace rather than direction, Walter and I had the conversation that I think people in our position have when they are honest with each other and clear-eyed about what is coming. We sat in the kitchen with coffee and we talked about what we wanted the remaining time to look like. He said, "I want to be here. In this house. As long as possible. I said, then that is what we will arrange. He said, I also want to make sure you are taken care of after. Not just financially. I want to make sure you know what you need to know and have what you need to have, and that no one can put you in a position you don't deserve to be in. I said, I have Margaret. He said, you will have Margaret. But I also want you to have a letter, and I want to have a conversation with Thomas, and I want to update everything while I still can do it clearly and correctly. I said, you've thought about this. He said, I have thought about this for 2 years. I wanted to wait until I was sure about what I wanted. I am sure now. I want you to understand what that conversation was. It was not morbid. It was not the conversation of 2 people surrendering to something. It was the conversation of 2 people who loved each other doing the specific work of that love while they still had time to do it. Walter understood, as he understood most things, that the work was more important than the avoidance of the work. That sitting with the documents and the difficult conversations now was a form of care for me that I would not understand the full value of until I needed it. He was right. In the remaining year of his life, Walter worked with Margaret to ensure that everything was as clear and as protected as it could be. He had the conversation with Thomas. He wrote the letter. He continued to work, to tend the roses, to walk the neighborhood when he was able, to teach me the things about this house and this life that he wanted me to know. He was not performing health he did not have. He was simply living the life he had with the time he had and doing the work that mattered. He died the way he had said he wanted to die, at home, in this house, in the bedroom at the end of the hall where the morning light comes in at the angle he had always liked. I was there. I held his hand. It was not dramatic and it was not easy, and it was exactly what it was supposed to be, which was the end of a life that had been lived carefully and well. I miss him every day. That is not melodrama either. It is simply true. The specific quality of his presence, the careful attention, the considered speech, the way he moved through a room, the way he noticed light, those things are absent in ways that I notice daily and that I expect I will notice for the rest of my life. What I have is what he built. The house. The roses. The documents. The letter. The attorney who has kept good notes for 32 years. The legal certainty that he worked to create because he understood that love without clarity is not sufficient protection. His children came in the spring. The 11-year-old, now 12, asked about the roses. I told her grandfather had planted them. She said, will you show me how he took care of them? I said, yes. Come back and I will show you. She came back. She brought a small notebook and she wrote down what I told her. The pruning schedule. The feeding. The way to recognize what the canes need. She was careful and attentive and she asked good questions and she reminded me, in the specific way that grandchildren sometimes do, of the person they came from. I am still learning the roses myself. I have made notes. I am being methodical. Walter would have approved. I want to say something to you before I close. Several things, because I am a paralegal and I believe in being specific. The first thing, if your spouse is in declining health, or if you are the person in the relationship who handles the legal and financial matters, I want you to invite your partner into that knowledge. Not as a burden. As a gift. Know your documents together. Sit with the attorney together. Understand together what protections exist and where they are and what they require. Walter had built my protection and I knew about it in outline, but I had never read through every provision myself. In the weeks after Thomas filed, there were moments when I was grateful for Margaret's certainty and moments when I wished I had built my own certainty before I needed it. Do not wait. The second thing, if you are the person being protected, the person whose spouse has been careful and deliberate about making sure you are taken care of, I want you to honor that by being present in the room where it is built. Do not leave it entirely to them. Ask questions. Read the documents. Know what has been done and why. The third thing is for anyone listening who has done what Thomas did. Who has made a choice in the grief and the money and the specific desperation of loss that has hurt someone they shared an important person with. I am not telling you what your path should be. But I want you to know that my door was not permanently closed. The children came. Something that was broken is not necessarily gone. The work of repair is yours to begin. That is what I have to offer. And the fourth thing, the one that matters most, is for the Walters. For the people who are thinking right now about what happens when they are gone. Who are building the floor that someone they love will need to stand on. Do the work. The documents and the conversations and the letters and the careful attention to what will be needed in your absence. It is unglamorous. It is not romantic in the sense that movies are romantic. But it is love. It is the specific form of love that keeps working after you are not there to keep working yourself. Walter's roses are still blooming. His house is still standing. The person he loved is still here. That is what careful love does. That is what it makes. My name is Ruth Coleman. I am 61 years old. My husband Walter died in November. His son arrived on my porch 14 days later with an attorney and a claim on my home. Walter had left me a letter and a will and an attorney who had spent 32 years making things unambiguous. I am still here. And I would do it again. Every document, every deposition, every day I sat in this kitchen and made my coffee and waited for Margaret to call. Every single time. If this story reached something in you, leave it in the comments. I read every one. And if you know someone who is sitting with a legal notice and not sure what to do, or someone whose spouse left them protected and they are only now finding out how important that protection is, send this to them. Sometimes the most important thing is knowing that the person who loved you made sure. We will have another story for you very soon. Until then, take care of yourself. You already know how.